I think the title of this panel discussion was very much inspired by eMedia Monitor's sponsorship and actually the topic of broadcast itself. And I think we probably can all see that the topic of broadcast and the definition of broadcast has kind of become redefined. It used to be TV, it used to be radio, might have been film, cinema, but I think it means something else now. So I think that's kind of the premise upon which we're going to ask some of our questions. I think some of the questions I'm also going to ask here, we've got Matt from Hotwire, Claire Pimm, ex-government in a new role as a Chief Communications Officer at LifeArc, so hopefully will tell us a little bit more about that. But definitely wanted to just sort of break the ice a little bit. It was something in relation to something Thomas mentioned yesterday about still TV being a one-to-many form of broadcasting. And we were talking when we were preparing for this session about this kind of concept, actually, weren't we, of a TV moment? And I asked the question, will we ever get these TV moments again? So we wanted to just do a little bit of an icebreaker. We do know each other because we're on the board together, but perhaps some of you might not know us. Maybe getting you to reflect from your past, from your childhood, maybe on a personal level. Can you remember a TV moment? Because there are sometimes, these kind of occasions that stick in our mind.
Do you want me to go first? Because I insulted you both when we were talking about this. Because I think the TV moment that was always stuck with me is like the 9/11, the towers. And we were talking about this, and I was like, oh, I was on the way back from school, and you both gave me the daggers. And
clearly are the dinosaurs.
Old.
Yeah. So I remember getting back, and it was just after the first tower had come down. And it was one of those moments that you were almost just frozen. You just were watching the TV, and you just couldn't take your eyes off of it. I think that's the power of TV in that moment, is that I think I stayed in front of the TV for the next few hours, didn't even take my bag off or do anything else, and I was almost just stuck there watching the evolution of the moment as it's. I mean, it wasn't ever going to sink in, but as the gravitas of the situation played out, and yeah, I think that will always stay with me, like that moment of coming back from a normal day at school, and then the world has just changed in front of your eyes. So,
you've been involved in preparations for some big TV moments, but can you tell us about any personal TV moments that might have hit you in that way?
So apart from Matt insulting us all and telling us we were old, I actually reflected that an awful lot of these big TV moments we talk about tend to be like the negative things. So the one I was reflecting on was the Boxing Day tsunami in Sri Lanka, and I'd been there 5 weeks earlier and just sitting, watching the horror of this thing that you could never imagine. But actually, there were also some really positive ones. So, my age here, Live Aid. The Live Aid concert was just something that everyone sat and watched. And then more recently, like the golfing legend Rory McIlroy getting his green jacket at the Masters, and it being a really big moment, and it told a story through audio-visual. So those TV moments do still have massive resonance, I believe.
But our broadcast habits are changing, aren't they? So we're talking about the idea of broadcast redefined. Broadcast, it means podcast, it means social video as well. It's something particularly, Nicole was talking about earlier from LinkedIn about, video being massive memory makers. But how are your own personal broadcast consumption habits changing? And does that sort of speak to perhaps society at large?
Yeah, I mean, it was interesting actually watching the panel a couple of sessions earlier talking about where they consume their media. And at the end, it was like, where are you consuming your media? It was still the BBC, it was still CNN, there was a podcast mentioned. And I think when we look at data now, we see on average about users spending about 4.5 hours a day on digital media. But the way that they're consuming it is in snippets. More and more you see attention spans are obviously declining. People are getting media in shorter forms, which means that we need to adapt and with that. So I think the Microsoft session yesterday talked about the Satya Nadella podcast, which was an hour and a half. You could reach a niche audience, but then it probably turned into multiple different types of content to maybe reach different audiences on different platforms. So I think as you're consuming it, you might just open an app quickly, scan something, see a quick video, and then switch your phone off, because then you're back onto the next task. So I think it's less about sitting down for half an hour and maybe like watching something all in one go, and it's more about drip feeding content.
Do you find you yourself are listening to both those short form types of, obviously we're all consuming that short form type of content through our social media feed, but are you getting involved in and listening personally to those kind of longer form,
Yeah.
on the jog or on the drive? Or
Yeah, so I'm lucky enough to walk to work, so that's my time in the morning when I can probably just not look at Slack or an email or what have you. So that's probably where I'm consuming a 35-minute podcast that makes you think, or it could be lighthearted depending on mood. So I'm consuming that, but then when you're at work or if you're on a break, you might just flick into LinkedIn and watch a video or what have you. So I think that's where the different forms of media can kind of reach the same audience, but in different ways.
those attention minutes are priceless. When you look at data, perhaps how long people might dwell on websites and so on, you might see them there for a minute or so, but to actually buy 35 minutes of focused attention is relatively priceless. So it just shows how you can get, I would imagine, some good return on investment from that point of view in terms of the attention minutes, but also in terms of that ability, that reuse of content, snipping up large bits of broadcast media and being able to reuse them and repurpose them for social media feeds. So Claire, you tell us a little bit about how your own personal broadcast consumption habits may have evolved, or maybe they haven't.
Well, I was going to say, I think I'm actually a dinosaur. So at the BBC, I mean, we still watch the news in our house. We sit down and watch the news every day, and we get up on a Sunday morning and we watch Laura Kuenssberg. And I've always really fascinated by how the BBC really milks that 1 hour of telly. It forms their news headlines across all of the broadcasts throughout the day. They clip it up, they run stories, they really milk that 1 hour of telly. But yeah, we do still watch the news. But actually yesterday over lunch, a colleague asked me, so what podcast do you listen to? And I suddenly thought, oh, that's actually now something I'm meant to think about and to do it. And, I use it as a professional tool, but actually I'm not sure I'm using it personally as well as I might be.
I thought it was fascinating, the point you said there about that Laura Kuenssberg programme and how it can sometimes set the agenda for what's discussed on the BBC later in the day. And perhaps in the past, that kind of work was done by the, say, printed Sunday papers, and perhaps less so. And do you think that that's because broadcast might be having a greater influence on that discussion? Or is it just related to the ways in which maybe the BBC, perhaps, I suppose, are getting clever at repurposing and stringing out the impact of their own content to make it live longer beyond that Sunday morning broadcast?
I definitely think that's what they're doing. They're going, this is our 1 hour of ingredients that we can then use throughout the day. It will be the top of the news headlines. It will be all over the website. They'll video clip it. They're just milking it and making it work as hard as possible for as long as possible for them. So they're getting a good ROI on 1 hour's worth of telly.
We were talking about this, weren't we, that maybe the way that you evaluate broadcast is different. So it's less about the viewership at that moment, and it's more about the half-life of that content. How long does it stay in front of different viewers? How is it reaching audiences in different ways? Is the effect longer lasting? So it just plays into how we analyse that and help our clients understand maybe the potential impact of those.
And having to look holistically over so many channels and aggregating those audiences to understand that broader impact over a longer period, perhaps might be today, but actually some of that viewership might come over the coming days. I suppose to that point as well, we were talking a little bit about local news, trust in local news versus less trust in other forms of news. I only just found out, because I don't watch the 1 o'clock news on the BBC, I guess I'm just eating my lunch at that time or flicking through my social media feed, that they've actually changed the format of the 1 o'clock news programme in the UK, and that they've inserted the regional broadcast element into the middle, so it's sort of topped and tailed with the national news. And perhaps that could be something to do with better engagement, better trust, or perhaps they're just experimenting with different forms of putting their content out there. You were the one that told me about it, Claire, so I just wondered if you had any perspectives on it.
Tell what I'm doing over lunch, can't you? No, I think it's really interesting, because it used to be you'd have the national news and then they'd go and here's the news in your region. What they now do is they do the national news for about 25 minutes, and then they give you a good 15, 20 minutes of your local news, and that's because It's been proven. You've got some lovely stats, but we trust our local news, we trust our local community, we trust our local voices far more than we trust the national ones. And so what they're doing is embedding it right in the heart of their programming. Obviously, they're thinking about their viewer demographics. People are watching it at lunchtime, nerds like me, but also like an older community who are really invested in their local area, and that's what they want to know. So they've shaped their broadcast output to meet that audience desire and need, and we know that that's what they're going to engage with.
Claire, you've spoken on this stage many times before, and particularly, I think, was it when we were back in Vienna last time and you were talking through, because you led a lot of the communications for the COVID response for UK government, and I think broadcast was a really important element of that, and I wondered if you can share any reflections on that time.
So, as many of you know, I ran COVID communications for the UK government for the full kind of 27 months that we ran comms on it. And we know in times of crisis, people look to authorities to give them reassurance, to give them information. And many people have seen Boris Johnson do his, I must now ask you to stay at home. And we realised, this is a massive crisis. Nobody knew what to do. And so we needed to be really regularly communicating with authority and with knowledge with the public. So we launched the 5 o'clock press conference, which happened religiously without fail at 5 o'clock every single day. And that was because we knew that they were looking for that reassurance. It became a much watch for everybody in the country. The UK government became the second most trusted broadcaster after the BBC through that period. But we deliberately designed it as a piece of audiovisual communication. So you had the symbolism of the head of your country, but deliberately flanked by 2 other authorities, one medical and one science. And, we did the whole podium and we decorated it and we used the colours of that podium and our marketing to kind of communicate with you on multiple levels about what we needed you to take away. And as I say, it had about 5 million people viewed in every single day. And when we stopped doing them, we got actually a massive backlash because people said, why have you stopped doing this? This is where I get my information from.
And those audience figures are actually higher than the typical audience figures you would probably get for your standard bit of BBC 6 o'clock news. So it was obviously drawing in more audience, and then, of course, that was flowing through. So, Matt, just want to sort of change tack a little bit, I suppose, because you're involved there at Hotwire. You head up analytics and AI. Recently moved to the States, so based in San Francisco, is that right? So you're obviously advising organisations perhaps to pivot the way in which they work with broadcast, and that can help them to reach audiences in different, more meaningful ways. And I just wondered if you could tell us a little bit about how perhaps the way broadcast is evolving, and we're no longer looking for that sort of 2-minute snippet perhaps on regional or local news or on the radio, but how are you advising them differently to perhaps experiment with these newer forms of broadcast media?
Yeah, I think, oftentimes clients can get bogged down in like their traditional media outlets that they want to kind of reach, maybe a top 25 list, a top 50 list. So for us, it's helping them kind of level set with who their audience is that they want to reach. Obviously do some upfront analysis on where they live, where they consume media, what type of audience is it? Is it a supporting audience? Is it a detracting audience? So it's understanding how we want to reach them, where they are, and what message we might want to kind of help shape, and then go from there. Because like you say, there's obviously TV, which we can help them kind of get mentioned on in broadcast, but then there's the podcast mentions as well. And it's about kind of taking that audience first approach to within the strategies overall, playing along with the earned media, so it's almost like a multi-channel approach is how we're helping the clients. I think more and more we're helping clients with kind of AI strategies as well. So thinking about the redefinition of broadcast, I think it's an interesting thing with AI now is picking up information from everywhere, obviously. So the written content is just going to be almost reformatted into multiple different types of content so that the AI can consume that content, learn about you and your brand, your messaging. So then when it predicts the next word, you're kind of like teaching and improving the model about you and your brand to make you more visible. So we're doing obviously a lot of GEO strategies at the moment with them with different clients, and that's a big part of like, can you repurpose content so that to reinforce messaging and reach different audiences?
Does it take a different type of media training, perhaps, to... I remember this stat, again, I think you've already stated it, Satya Nadella speaking for a podcast, an hour and a half or so on, and that's a different type of media training, I suppose, than media training for the snippets. Has the format of the media training changed?
Yeah, we've actually seen an uptick in media training over the past 6 to 12 months with clients who are requesting maybe more one-on-one time with our kind of VP of media strategy to really help them either reinforce messaging in certain with certain outlets who maybe they need to improve their reputation with that media, or when like that example yesterday on a longer form, maybe more of a niche audience, how can messages be peppered throughout but clear so that it resonates best with those audiences? I think that's where we're seeing the value with clients right now.
And I think as a communicator, what we're needing to do is to train our people to be able to talk in depth in like long form podcast formats, as well as at the same time recognizing you want to clip these things up to make them work really hard. So they need to be able to do long form discussion and really short, sharp sound bites at the same time. And that takes practicing. It means you've got to know what you're going to say and you pepper it through and you get them to rehearse it.
So you've got a new role, recent role, Claire. So literally, I think you're in week 2 in your new position as CCO at LifeArc, and you had a great description of the organisation. I can't quite remember it word for word, so perhaps we could hear about it from you. And I'm really keen to know how you're going to be using broadcast in your strategy now that you've moved from public sector into private sector.
Yes, so I'm describing LifeArc as the greatest organisation you have never heard of. So look them up because they're extraordinary and they're doing really innovative stuff around exciting science to find medical solutions to rare diseases and global health problems. So I hope by this time next year you will have heard of them. But obviously a lot of what they're doing is like really complicated scientific medical stuff that general audiences are not that literate about, and we want to move into getting drugs, diagnostics and devices to patients. So we're going to need people to know us and to trust us. And so I'm looking at how we take like these really clever scientific medical things and make them into something accessible. So we'll be looking at how you use kind of podcasts, but also to that short and long form. And a bit like during COVID, how we made the R number something that actually people understood, and they understood what the variations of it meant and then how we needed to adjust our behaviours. So I'm going to try and make science and medical accessible to people like me who do not have a scientific or medical background.
Something that Nicole said earlier, again, I think I might have already mentioned this quote, so Nicole, I'm mentioning the same quote twice in this session, but video is a memory maker, and I just want to actually give a shout out because there is an interesting webinar going to be launched on eMedium or through eMedia Monitor in the next few weeks with a behavioural scientist, a guy called Patrick Fagan. He actually worked for Cambridge Analytica, but let's not boo him, he's actually a really good guy. And linked to that, actually, there's a little known fact that some of you might not have known, is that the other guy, well, there's many guys, I'm calling them all guys, that's just stereotypes here, but there's another guy that worked at Cambridge Analytica who did actually start off, I think, as a freelance media analyst in the media intelligence profession. So that's just interesting itself. But when I spoke to him for this webinar, it was interesting to understand about the way in which audio-visual, kind of like the moving image and the spoken word, can kind of cut through to the subconscious that much easier. I think it can be a much more powerful way of communicating than through the written word. And then we also have to reflect on the fact that there are a certain proportion of certain communities that actually can't read, and so this kind of visual and spoken communication is very important in reaching some of those hard-to-reach audiences. And I just wondered if you've had any reflections on any of the campaigns that you might have worked on in the past that sort of talk about either the emotional element of broadcast content or perhaps using these different forms of media to reach different types of audiences, in that niche way.
So I worked on both the Queen's funeral and the King's coronation, both of which were very intense audio. I mean, so for the Queen's funeral, it was like 12 and a half days of constant TV, and that's all they talked about. And part of our job was to give them enough stuff to talk about. But in the UK, the average reading age is between 9 and 11. So the use of audio-visual and to cause that both understanding and that emotional resonance is really critical. I would always say, though, however, that you don't always get the impact that you were looking for. So during the King's coronation, we'd all worked really hard, and there was lots of beautiful pageantry, and I was working at Defence at the time, and so all of the armed forces were out doing their lovely, doing the King's coronation. And of course, within a few minutes, the thing that was trending all over social media, nothing to do with the King, it was to do with Penny Mordaunt, because she had on this fabulous frock and she was carrying this sword like this the whole time. And so the internet just went wild with Game of Thrones type memes, comments on how strong her core must be. But it was all about Penny Mordaunt, nothing to do with the King. So, these images do cause these resonances, but quite often what you've got going on broadcast and what social media is doing with it at the same time can be an interesting juxtaposition, and you have obviously no control over that.
And what about you, Matt? Hotwire specifically in the
I
tech
don't have any
space, so
king or queen stories, but no, we work with a lot of B2B brands, and I think what Nicole was talking about, especially on LinkedIn, because obviously that's where a big B2B audience community is, some of the messaging can be really bland and just not inspirational at all. So a lot of our work is to try to lift that messaging up with either video content, as she mentioned earlier, or working with kind of influencers to just lift the brand up to meet the audience where they are. I think Dimitar said something interesting on that previous panel, that no one has time just to read through a huge long-form article. So I think it's mixing, as you mentioned before, Steph, about mixing the word and the visual cues to really kind of resonate with audiences in the best way possible.
I mean, to that extent, on LinkedIn right now, excuse me, there's a video. The British government is retendering for some big media contracts that some of you may bid for. But traditionally, we would just publish the invitation to tender. What we're now doing is recording videos and putting them out on LinkedIn and saying, this is what's happening, this is how you can apply, this is how you can get involved. So, trying to, even in quite dull media kind of business world, actually, we're trying to engage with people much more easily.
So I guess that initiative is being driven by comms rather than procurement, because I couldn't imagine them being quite so creative. Right. So we said we were promising the warm-up act to Johnny, so we wanted to just have a little bit of fun as well. I had sort of icebreaker moment before, and I'm just going to hit you with this silly question. What is your favourite TV programme? Because that sometimes tells a lot about the person. And we haven't practiced this one, so I'm really hitting you with it.
It is.
I'm fairly boring, so I watch a lot of sport, so that's probably my go-to.
Do you like golf?
I do like golf. Golfing legend Rory, that wasn't my word to say, but no, I think broadcast can be quite serendipitous at times with the ways that it can work. But no, I think, what am I watching at the moment? Race Across the World is the latest series is on. I like travelling, so that kind of sucks me in. It gives me a bit of an hour of escapism. I think that's kind of how I probably use TV at the moment, is just to kind of switch off and escape at the end of the day.
Is that the same with you, Claire?
I have a squidgy end of the day with my daughter, and which she is obsessed by the Gilmore Girls and Friends, so that's what I'm watching.
Oh, it shows I don't watch enough TV because I've never heard of the Gilmore Girls.
So we're watching hard-hitting TV as well.
Yeah. And obviously the BBC News.
Yeah, if I was answering the question, it would actually be the Real Housewives of Cheshire. So it shows how stressful our jobs are. What we could do. I remember in the early days, in the 90s, when I was doing lots of hardcore media analysis with Richard and Paul, and all I could read in terms of a magazine was Heat magazine, and it just shows that I suppose one needs to have this form of media as a sort of decompression as well, and as a form of entertainment. And I suppose we've been reflecting on it in terms of news, but broadcast and audio-visual is so much more than just...
What we're saying is, come to us for hard-hitting programme recommendations.
But actually, on a serious, work-related note, in the not-for-profit world and in government, we've worked with broadcasters and soap operas to integrate the storylines that we, the issues that we're working on. So, I've worked with Hollyoaks on mental health, and I worked with Coronation Street on neonatal care. So you can work with broadcasters to get the issues of your organisation to a broader audience and people who might not normally have engaged with it. And they also then do a ton of PR for you because they're being interviewed by Take a Break and the Radio Times and all of that.
And it's true, you're reaching those audience who may not have otherwise received that messaging either through the newspapers or through the news. So it is very an impactful medium, we would say. So I hadn't quite practiced a wrap-up of the panel session, but I feel that we're getting close to Johnny's session.
Yeah.
So
we can stop fluffing
we
for
could
Johnny
probably
now.
stop.
Yeah.
And then if you were wondering why we mentioned things like dinosaur and golf, maybe Johnny will explain.
I think that's us.
Great. All right, round of applause for the panel.
I don't know why I'm clapping.
Let's open it up to give one question for the audience before we end. Does anybody want one question? We will have, so we're obviously Johnny, then we have the closing housekeeping, and then we will have refreshments so that you will have, for those of you who aren't racing off, there will be some refreshments that you can continue to network over. Okay, so we will take back the 3 minutes with another round of applause for Steph, Claire, and Matt, 3 of our AMAC International Board Directors. Thank you so much.
Stop tapping us.
I should have moved my thing to the left there.